Abigail Adams' greatest legacy, I think, to the role of First Lady is that if you are political by nature, be fully political.
She was born on November 11th, 1744, in Weymouth, Massachusetts.
She was encouraged by her parents to read and to study.
And it wasn't just in the basics, it was also in Shakespearean literature, it was in the letters, the classics.
In 1762, Abigail was reunited with John Adams, an old acquaintance from her childhood. He was smitten by Abigail's knowledge of poetry, philosophy, and politics.
They met when she was 15 and he was 27.
There was a strong shared values.
John and Abigail Adams married on October 25th, 1764. They had 6 children over 10 years, but John's duties as a politician kept him away from home for long stretches.
John and Abigail Adams spent years apart, and yet it never seemed to impair their relationship.
John Adams was helping to foment the revolution that would lead to independence. He continually reported to Abigail through their letters.
The letters of John and Abigail Adams still serve as one of the most prized artifacts in the United States history.
If you read their letters, you find a great deal of affection between them.
They give us not only a very personal sense of who the two of them were, they give us also a sense of the uncertainty of the creation of the United States of America.
The role of John Adams in the Revolution elevated his status as a politician. He served as vice president for 2 terms under President Washington.
She was very persuasive in her husband questioning George and Martha Washington and Thomas Jefferson's commitment to slavery.
In 1796, John Adams became the 2nd president of the United States.
Abigail Adams couldn't help but express her opinion.
She had some really tough quotes about her white male peers. She called them out pretty much as being hypocrites, and that was pretty bold.
Abigail's critics returned fire with claims that her political activism was meddling in the president's affairs.
She was even sarcastically called Mrs. President for the very overt political role that she took.
John Adams lost the election of 1800 to his rival, Thomas Jefferson. The Adams retired to Quincy, Massachusetts.
John and Abigail Adams were able to spend real time together. They had time to really reconnect.
She didn't live to see her son, John Quincy Adams, become president, but she had great confidence that he would continue to rise politically.
Abigail Adams died on October 28, 1818. She was 73 years old.
Dolley Madison's greatest legacy is the idea that a first lady is the mother of a nation.
She was born Dolly Payne on May 20th, 1768, in New Garden, North Carolina. She was one of 7 siblings raised in a strict Quaker household.
She was really not allowed to mix in the larger society.
She is known to have been very beautiful, and attention was lavished on her, and that butted heads really with the Quaker religion.
In January 1790, Dolly married a Quaker lawyer named John Todd. They had 2 sons, but the marriage ended tragically when a yellow fever epidemic struck Philadelphia just a few years later.
She lost in a short period of time her husband, her son, her in-laws.
The following year, Dolly Todd met James Madison. They married that same year, but James Madison's status as a non-Quaker led to Dolly's expulsion from the Quaker community.
It was difficult for her at first, but she said to be at peace with that. She and James Madison never had any children of their own, but James Madison helped to raise Dolly's surviving son.
In 1800, James Madison had been retired from politics when President Jefferson beckoned him to return to serve as Secretary of State. Madison accepted, and a new world opened for Dolly.
When Thomas Jefferson became president, both he and his vice president were widowed, and so Dolley Madison oftentimes came to serve as a hostess.
And she's credited with bringing a certain charm and etiquette to the White House.
When James Madison became president in 1809, Dolley Madison understood the political value of White House social functions in ways that her predecessors did not.
She hosted the first inaugural ball for 400 people. She opened up the White House in a very stylish, accessible way.
Her physical appearance was regal, but in contrast to that was her spirit. her warmth, her accessibility.
During the War of 1812, Dolley Madison risked her safety in order to save vital artifacts from the White House during a British invasion of Washington.
She famously protected the portrait of former President George Washington.
After 8 years in the White House, the Madisons retired to Orange County, Virginia, where they lived until James's death in June of 1836.
After his death, she was burdened with the gambling debts of her son.
In 1837, Dolley Madison returned to Washington and continued her involvement in politics.
She served really as a mentor to her successors, and in her own way continued to help through them shape the public role of First Lady.
Dolley Madison died in Washington on July 12, 1849, at the age of 81.
I think Mary Todd Lincoln is remembered as a First Lady of complete tragedy.
She was born Mary Todd in Lexington, Kentucky on December 13, 1818. Her life in a large, wealthy family was comfortable but lonely.
Unfortunately, her mother passed away when she was 6 years old, and her father quickly got remarried, and Mary did not have a great relationship with her stepmother.
She focused very intently on her studies. She pursued education and she read the newspapers, and she began to develop what people called a masculine mind.
Mary Todd left home in 1839 to live with her sister in Springfield, Illinois. It wasn't long before she met a young lawyer named Abraham Lincoln. It was an unlikely romance.
First of all, physically, they made an odd pair. Mary was a little bit plump and rather short, and Lincoln was very tall and very thin.
There wasn't a lot of love for Abraham Lincoln in the Todd family because they really felt like he came from nothing.
Mary Todd and Abraham Lincoln were married in November of 1842.
And it was the first time that Mary Todd Lincoln really realized what it was like to have hardship. So she sort of stood by her man, if you will, but in a sense felt a tremendous isolation from her family.
This isolation increased for Mary when Abraham Lincoln claimed the White House in 1860.
And in the case of Mary Lincoln, you had her as a member of the Southern aristocracy, married to the Union president who was leading the nation into civil war. So without even doing or saying anything, the odds were stacked against her.
She just felt this constant lack of support by the Washington socialites who were just abhorred that these Midwesterners have taken over the White House.
As the Civil War raged on, Mary Lincoln's actions in the White House further angered her critics.
She spent an enormous sum of money for the time on redecorating the White House. She also spent a huge amount on her clothes, but it did alienate her from people in Washington and, of course, from common people who were suffering from the war.
On February 20th, 1862, Mary lost her son to typhoid fever.
When Mrs. Lincoln lost her son Willie, there was a very bitter, sarcastic, rather than supportive reaction through most of the North of the Union, which was sort of this attitude of, well, at least you had the comfort of seeing your son die.
On April 14th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at the Ford's Theater. Mary sat next to him.
After Lincoln's assassination, her mental state overall started to decline, and it was even after that point that she was institutionalized, that she actually tried to commit suicide twice.
Somebody once said at the time of her death that in many ways she really had died in that theater beside her husband.
Mary Todd Lincoln spent her final years in Springfield, Illinois with her sister. She died on July 16, 1882, at the age of 63.
Jackie was an icon even in her own time, and she was worshipped and adored as if she were a movie star.
Jackie Kennedy saw her role as establishing the White House as a beacon for arts and culture.
She was born Jacqueline Lee Bouvier on July 28, 1929, in Southampton, New York.
She was the child of privilege. They grew up in New York and summered in all the right places.
She went to Farmington, which is a girls' school in Connecticut, and then went to Vassar, and then studied in France at the Sorbonne.
Jackie was a skilled writer and took an interest in journalism following her education.
Jackie could have had a brilliant career as a fashion journalist In 1951, she won Vogue magazine's Prix de Paris, which was a writing contest with a prize of an internship in Paris. But her mother wouldn't let her go.
In 1952, Jackie met U.S. Representative John Kennedy at a dinner party of a mutual friend.
Jack was an aspiring politician, and she was beautiful, and she was charming and elegant and well-educated. So I think on paper, she was the perfect partner for him, as well as in person.
They were married in September of the following year at St. Mary's Church in Newport, Rhode Island. The transition to a life as a politician's wife was not easy for Jackie.
She wasn't a particularly political person. She hated campaigning. She didn't like to be out in a lot of crowds.
She was not by his side the way some wives are today on the campaign trail.
In 1960, John F. Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon in a close election. Jackie immediately set out to revitalize the culture of the White House.
Jackie Kennedy had a sense of style, and she applied it to the White House.
Jackie always had lots of celebrities and glamorous people, and she always had great entertainment. It was just a whole different scene.
Jackie's sense of personal style made her a darling to the media and an icon to American women.
Kennedy was the youngest American president, and instead of trying to look older and more distinguished, he and Jackie really flaunted their youth.
Women were extremely admiring of her style and her sense of fashion and her glamour.
Jackie's popularity extended far beyond the borders of the United States.
She brought a level of travel and training and education to the White House that we really hadn't seen before.
She charmed all of the world leaders. She was very sophisticated, and she knew how to handle herself socially.
In 1963, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy brought a tragic end to Jackie's time in the White House.
And John celebrates his 3rd birthday with a soldier's farewell to his father.
The assassination of Robert Kennedy in June of 1968 made Jackie fear for the safety of her children. She moved to Greece and married a wealthy shipping magnate named Aristotle Onassis.
I don't think it was a very happy time. She was married to this man who married her because he wanted a trophy wife, and she married him because she wanted the money and the protection.
After her second husband's death in 1975, Jackie returned to the States and to her passion of the publishing industry.
She was a respected editor, and she knew what she was doing.
She could walk around New York and edit books, but people always found her rather unapproachable. There was always a sense of tragedy around her.
Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died on May 19, 1994. She was 64.
Pat Nixon was very much the helpmate, the quiet wife.
I think she's somebody Pat came out of a place of great struggle and made something of her life on her own by her own determination.
She was born Thelma Catherine Ryan on March 16, 1912. She lost both parents during her childhood and worked long hours on their farm in California.
She worked her early years probably harder than any First Lady and put herself and her 2 brothers through college, graduating cum laude.
While working as a teacher in Whittier, California, Pat met a recent Duke Law graduate named Richard Nixon.
He was obviously smitten, so smitten, in fact, that he would pick her up, take her to dates that she had with other men, and then drive her home. After about a year, when he asked her to marry him, she said yes.
They were married in Riverside, California in 1940. 6 years later, Richard Nixon made a run for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives.
I don't think Pat Nixon had any real interest in politics. I don't think she cared about it that much.
On the other hand, because of the strong work ethic, she could do politics. Just some hours after her first child, Patricia, was born, she was out doing campaign things.
And finally, Senator Nixon of California is elected by the delegates as their nominee for vice president.
After serving 2 terms as vice president, Richard Nixon made a run at the presidency in 1960. It was a close race that he lost to John F. Kennedy. But in 1968, Richard Nixon returned and scored a presidential victory over Hubert Humphrey. The Nixons moved into the White House the following January.
Mrs. Nixon always had her own schedule when she traveled abroad as First Lady. She was the most well-traveled wife, at least up to that point, of a president.
She went to Liberia, Ghana, and the Ivory Coast. But whereas Jackie Kennedy had kind of gone sometimes and been this sort of dazzling person, Pat Nixon very strongly took on the customs and the culture of the places she went.
Pat Nixon's efforts within the White House were equally popular to the public.
She made the House as accessible to as wide a diversity of people as possible. She instituted evening tours. She instituted tours of the gardens and the grounds. She even had brochures made in foreign languages so people who didn't speak English could guide themselves through the rooms. And at night, she had the White House lit up with floodlights.
I shall leave this office with regret at not completing my term, but with gratitude.
On August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon resigned following news of his involvement in the Watergate scandal. It was an abrupt ending for Pat Nixon.
She was deeply saddened and very distressed. She believed that Watergate was simply a political firestorm, that it was going to subside.
A lot of what she learned about Watergate occurred in the very last days when transcripts were released.
After the White House, Pat Nixon wasn't well. She had a fairly serious stroke. Later on, she was diagnosed with lung cancer.
Pat Nixon died at her New Jersey home on June 22, 1993. She was 81 years old. She was born Elizabeth Ann Bloomer on April 8, 1918, in Chicago, Illinois.
She grew up really in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and when she was a young girl, her father died.
The tragic death of her father to carbon monoxide poisoning put pressure on young Betty to provide for her family. She took jobs modeling and teaching dance.
The love of her life was dance, and she told her mother that when she finished school, she was going to go off and be a dancer, and her mother was really not committed to that idea.
In 1942, she married a salesman named William Warren.
They were married for 5 years. And in her autobiography, Mrs. Ford referred to this first marriage as the 5-year misunderstanding.
Just as her divorce was finalized, Betty met a young lawyer named Gerald Ford, who was just beginning his career as a politician.
He was a little apprehensive because if you aspire to a political life, you would not necessarily marry somebody who'd been married before, but he was so drawn to her.
They were married on October 15, 1948. Just 2 weeks after Gerald Ford had won his first term in Congress.
When they moved to Washington, she went through what a lot of congressional wives went through and still do, is 4 children in pretty rapid succession.
Throughout her husband's 13 congressional terms, Betty Ford became a popular figure in organizations like the National Federation of Republican Women.
She was very comfortable with people. I don't believe that she ever felt the tension of invasion of her privacy the way that some others have.
On October 12, 1973, Gerald Ford was nominated to the office of Vice President.
Mrs. Ford had many reservations about Gerald Ford becoming Vice President. They had thought that when he finished his congressional term, they were going to move back to Michigan.
After the Watergate scandal, President Nixon announced his resignation on August 9, 1974. Vice President Ford was promptly sworn in as the 38th President of the United States.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
There was a lot of distrust of the presidency, and both she and Jerry Ford made the commitment to bring integrity back to government.
I believe that truth is the glue that holds government together.
She had causes she wanted to promote and issues she wanted to talk about. Betty Ford was a breath of fresh air after Pat Nixon.
Just weeks after arriving in the White House, Betty Ford was diagnosed with breast cancer and underwent a mastectomy. She went public with the news in hopes of raising awareness.
In those days, people didn't talk about that, and so when you had breast cancer, it was sort of shameful. She probably saved enormous numbers of lives because she was so open about it.
Betty Ford continued to be an outspoken voice on a variety of hot-button issues, including abortion and drug use. Her work for the women's movement and the ERA prompted Time magazine to name her a Woman of the Year in 1975.
You never got a feeling that she was plotting or scheming. She was just absolutely who she was.
In 1978, just 1 year out of the White House, Betty Ford confronted her addiction to alcohol.
She went off to a rehab program, and when she emerged, she made a commitment to carry the message of sobriety.
She founded the Betty Ford Clinic in 1982.
Just as she did with breast cancer, she took addiction out of the closet and made it okay to talk about.
Today, the Betty Ford Center is the most successful and the most widely known treatment center in the world.
Betty Ford died on July 8, 2011, in Rancho Mirage, California. She was 93 years old. She was born Anne Frances Robbins on July 6, 1921, in New York.
Her birth father essentially abandoned her and her mother.
Nancy Reagan's mother was an actress, and she was on the road and away from Nancy. So I think she always felt kind of abandoned as a young child.
In 1929, Nancy was 7 years old when her mother married a prominent neurosurgeon named Loyal Davis. The move to his home in Chicago provided Nancy with a strong parental figure.
He was always there for her, which her biological father wasn't. He was quite inspirational for her.
After graduating from Smith College in 1943, Nancy moved to Hollywood to pursue work as an actress. It was there that she met an actor and recent divorcee named Ronald Reagan.
It ended up being an incredible love affair that people still, when they reflect on it and speak of it, feel it was one of the greatest relationships they've ever witnessed.
They married in a small ceremony on March 4, 1952. Nancy quickly settled into the role of homemaker, while her husband moved toward a career in politics.
Well, it wasn't really too long into their marriage that she had her first child, her daughter. As a result of that, there really wasn't all that much time for Ronald and Nancy Reagan to just be, newlyweds.
He had 2 children from the first marriage, and Nancy was a sometime mother to those 2.
In 1967, Ronald Reagan was elected governor of California. Life under the political limelight was not easy for Nancy.
The political coverage she received as a governor's wife was hypercritical.
The press was very hard on Nancy Reagan. They really played into the caricature and stereotypes of her as wealthy, privileged, distant.
Nancy Reagan responded to the criticisms by becoming a much more visible force in her husband's presidential campaigns.
Every strategist knew what a powerful ally Nancy Reagan could be, and if they got on the wrong side of her, that they'd be gone.
In 1980, Ronald Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter to become the 40th President of the United States.
Nancy Reagan came in and undertook some refurbishing and redesign projects within the White House, and it led to some negative press.
But even her harshest critics could not deny Nancy's devotion to her husband.
Nancy Reagan was there as the president's wife, first and foremost.
She was highly conscientious about his nutrition, about his rest and sleep, about making sure he wasn't overworked.
In 1982, Nancy Reagan launched a national drug awareness campaign called Just Say No.
Nancy Reagan herself didn't just give it lip service. She traveled about 250,000 miles to try to promote the Just Say No campaign.
Eventually, it became a policy issue that she was very much involved in.
After 8 years in the White House, Ronald and Nancy Reagan returned to California.
They were the most devoted couple that most people had ever seen.
They traveled around the world. They both wrote their memoirs, but once his Alzheimer's set in, Mrs. Reagan became his caretaker.
Ronald Reagan passed away on June 5, 2004. That same year, Nancy Reagan took an aggressive stance in support of stem cell research.
Nancy Reagan became more involved, asking then President George W. Bush to take a real look at embryonic stem cell funding and research.
Nancy Reagan has a fascinating legacy in that it goes from somebody seen as more style than substance and ended as having perhaps more substance than style.
Hillary Rodham was born in Chicago in 1947 and raised in Park Ridge, Illinois, by mother Dorothy and strict, demanding father Hugh. Although she would one day become a liberal Democrat, back in 1964, teenage Hillary pounded the pavement trying to get the vote out for conservative presidential nominee Barry Goldwater.
When she went to Wellesley, she was a Goldwater girl, and it was basically the Vietnam War that turned her around. And by the time she spoke at the senior graduation, she was an anti-war person, very loudly so, and very articulate.
While focused on her studies at Yale Law School, she clearly had some free time as she began a relationship with future husband Bill Clinton. Several years after graduating, she moved to Bill's native Arkansas. In 1975, she married Bill Clinton as he pursued a career in politics. He became governor, and for the next 12 years, Hillary would work as a lawyer and sit on boards both corporate and nonprofit. In 1980, she gave birth to their daughter Chelsea and became one of America's most powerful lawyers as a partner in the Rose Law Firm. In 1992, Bill was elected president, and Hillary became the First Lady.
She was just as talented and educated as Bill Clinton was, and he really viewed her as a partner. This was someone that when he was campaigning, he said, you know, you're getting two for the price of one, and he got her involved immediately in the healthcare task force, and that was something that made a lot of people uncomfortable because they weren't used to seeing a strong First Lady role.
Her task force to reform healthcare failed, and the Clintons' dealing in the Whitewater scandal made headlines. When Kenneth Starr revealed an affair between Bill and Monica Lewinsky, the lurid details of the affair became known to the world.
The Monica Lewinsky scandal was obviously very, very personally troubling for Hillary Clinton. She had to deal with probably the biggest humiliation of her entire life in front of the eyes of the world.
At the same time that the Congress was voting on whether to convict her husband, she was meeting, I believe, in the residence of the White House with Harold Ickes, her longtime advisor, discussing her prospects in the U.S. Senate race. And I think she saw this as a way to build a path for herself that was separate from her husband.
She won the New York Senate seat and quickly became one of the most prominent senators in the country. In 2007, she announced her candidacy for the presidency. At the time, many political pundits believed she was the inevitable choice to be the next president. Unfortunately for Hillary, another historic candidate had different plans.
One of the ironies, of course, both had dreamed of the day that they would see a black president of the United States in their lifetimes. And what they never bargained for is that that he would run against them on their watch.
During the Democratic primaries, Hillary's inevitability became much less likely as Barack Obama rattled off an impressive stretch of primary wins. Hillary kept her word to her millions of supporters by running till the very end of the primary process, despite calls for her to quit the race for the sake of party unity. On June 7th, her historic presidential candidacy, which saw her become the first woman ever to win a presidential primary, came to an end, and she threw her support behind Barack Obama.
She said, if you support me, you need to support him. And right up until the end, there were people who said, no, you know, I believe in you, Hillary Clinton, but I am not transferring that to Barack Obama. But she kept going back.
If Hillary Clinton has proved anything to the world, it's that she's about as tough as they come, and she won't be easily deterred.
When I think about Laura Bush, I think underrated.
I always got the feeling that she was a force for good when it came to her husband's temperament.
Laura is the love of my life.
Laura Lane Welch was born in Midland, Texas, on November 4th, 1946. She was an only child in a home where both parents contributed to her father's successful real estate business.
She grew up in a landscape that was dull, but through the world of books, I think her imagination took her all over the place.
On the night of November 6th, 1963, Laura was involved in a tragic car accident.
She ran a stop sign and hit a car broadside, and the driver was killed. It had the effect of making her a little more thoughtful, a little sadder, a little more world-wise.
Laura went on to get her degree in education from Southern Methodist University in Dallas. She was working as a teacher when she met George W. Bush at a barbecue hosted by mutual friends.
They hit it off right from the start, and they were married shortly after meeting each other.
Laura Bush's life in politics began almost immediately after marriage, when her husband ran for Congress in 1978.
One can imagine at the time how startling it was for her. She was not a public speaker, and she was not particularly interested in politics.
The campaign ended in defeat. A few years later, George and Laura had twin daughters, Jenna and Barbara.
George W. drank too much and at age 40 had kind of a dramatic turnaround. Laura had evidently given him an ultimatum too, that he needed to stop.
She played a very important role in George W. Bush's life, and when he suggested to her that he might consider getting back into politics, she was all for it.
In 1995, George W. Bush was elected governor of Texas. Laura Bush became more visible as First Lady of the state.
She focused on two areas that would follow her into the White House. One was education, the other literacy.
George W. Bush went on to win a close presidential race in 2000.
Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the President of the United States.
The transition to First Lady of the United States wasn't easy for Laura.
I think Laura Bush is a very private person, and the continual demands of the media were a challenge for her.
She herself, in those first 9 months, really was a bit remote. She spent a lot more time down at their new home in Texas than she did in the White House.
In 2001, after just months in the White House, the terrorist attacks of 9/11 changed the expectations of the presidency, including Laura Bush's duties as First Lady.
For a while, she was referred to as comforter-in-chief.
Laura Bush began to address the concerns that parents had about fear and anxiety in children.
Laura Bush continued to expand her reach as First Lady throughout her 2 terms. She stressed the importance of issues like health, literacy, and gender equality.
She carried that message to a lot of the traditional Muslim countries where she had to be careful as not seeming to import American values.
Laura and her husband left politics in 2009, but Laura continues to work hard on the initiatives she championed in the White House.
Michelle Obama is the first African-American First Lady. She will always go down in history for that, and she will always be seen as a pioneer for others to follow.
Born Michelle LaVaughn Robinson on January 17, 1964 in Chicago, Michelle Obama was raised in a blue-collar home on Chicago's South Side. She went to Princeton University in 1981 and then on to law school after her college graduation.
After she graduated from Harvard Law School in 1988, Michelle Obama moved back to her hometown of Chicago, where she began working at a law firm.
She was assigned to be a mentor to a young summer intern named Barack Obama, who then decided he wanted to ask her out on a date. As his mentor, Michelle thought that was inappropriate, but eventually she did relent, and they ultimately married on October 3rd, 1992.
Michelle Obama left corporate law to work in the public sector in 1991. She briefly worked as assistant to Chicago Mayor Richard Daley, and later started a nonprofit to help train people for careers in public service. She became an associate dean at the University of Chicago in 1996, and then a vice president at the University Medical Center in 2005.
In addition to being the top breadwinner in the Obama family due to her position at the University of Chicago, Michelle also gave birth during that time to 2 daughters, Malia in 1998 and Natasha, known as Sasha, in 2001.
Michelle Obama helped her husband get elected to the Senate in 2004. She campaigned with him while still trying to maintain as normal a life as possible with her daughters and raising them.
When Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, Michelle took a leave of absence from her work to help with the campaign and still have time for her kids. Michelle Obama officially became the 44th First Lady of the United States when her husband was sworn in as president on January 20th, 2009.
She was extremely effective in a number of her initiatives as First Lady, including Let's Move, which was a program focused on eradicating childhood obesity through fitness, as well as her extraordinary work in supporting military personnel and their families.
Michelle Obama, in a time of extreme partisan politics, has found issues that both parties can agree on and that really bring people together.
During Barack Obama's 2012 re-election run, Michelle Obama traveled the country to support him and played an important role in his success. She was so popular and effective on the stump, she earned the nickname the Closer.
Michelle Obama is a phenomenon in the White House. She has managed to navigate the racial divide in this country, the gender divide, and the demands that she do something meaningful.
Michelle Obama is a popular First Lady. She was clearly a good mother, clearly a good wife. Her husband clearly listened to her, and she was a vigorous, attractive presence.
It's hard to know what Michelle Obama will do after the White House. She has the experience, the temperament, the education, and the visibility to assume importance in many sectors.
The only limit to your achievements is the strength of your dreams and your willingness to work for them.
What happened at this podium last night was a fiasco. Few people blaming Melania, but rather her speechwriting team.